The road to Concord. Strategic genius and tactical acumen on the battlefield enabled Muhammad and his followers to achieve a series of stunning successes. The support of the Quraysh tribe and the dominant political elite in Mecca had been crucial as well, providing a platform for persuading the tribes of southern Arabia to hear and accept the message of the new faith. The opportunities that opened up with the collapse of Persia likewise came at the right moment. But two other important reasons also help explain the triumph of Islam in the early part of the 7th century, the support provided by Christians, and above all, that given by Jews. In a world where religion seems to be the cause of conflict and bloodshed, it is easy to overlook the ways in which the great faiths learnt and borrowed from each other. To the modern eye, Christianity and Islam seem to be diametrically opposed, but in the early years of their coexistence, relations were not so much pacific as warmly encouraging. And if anything, the relationship between Islam and Judaism was even more striking for its mutual compatibility. The support of the Jews in the Middle East was vital for the propagation and spread of the word of Muhammad. Although the material for the early Islamic history is complicated, an unmistakable and striking theme can be consistently teased from the literature of this period. Whether Arabic, Armenian, Syriac, Greek, or Hebrew, as well as from the archaeological evidence, Muhammad and his followers went to great lengths to take capital on the fears of Jews and Christians as Muslim control expanded. When Muhammad was cornered in Yathrib in southern Arabia in the 620s, soliciting the help of the Jews had been one of his key strategies. This was a town and a region that was steeped in Judaism and Jewish history. Barely a century earlier, one fanatical Jewish ruler of Himyar had overseen the systematic persecution of the Christian minority, which crystallized a broad pattern of alliances that still held firm. Persia had come in to support the Himyarites against the alliance of Rome and Ethiopia. Muhammad was eager to conciliate with the Jews of southern Arabia, starting with the elders of Yathrib. Leading Jews in the town, later renamed Medina, pledged their support to Muhammad in return for guarantees of mutual defense. These were laid out in a formal document that stated that their own faith and their possessions would be respected now and in the future by Muslims. It also set out a mutual understanding between Judaism and Islam. Followers of both religious factions pledged to defend each other in the event that either was attacked by any third party. No harm would come to Jews, and no help would be given to their enemies. Muslims and Jews would cooperate with one another, extending sincere advice and counsel. It helped then that Muhammad's revelations seemed not only conciliatory, but familiar. There was much in common with the Old Testament, for example, not least in the veneration for the prophets and for Abraham in particular, as all these faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, were from the Abrahamic tradition and are called the Abrahamic faiths. And there was obvious common ground for those who repudiated Jesus' status as the Messiah. It was not just that Islam was not a threat to Judaism. There were elements that seemed to go hand in glove with it. Word soon began to spread among Jewish communities that Muhammad and his followers were allies. An extraordinary text written in North Africa in the late 630s records how news of the Arab advances was being welcomed by Jews in Palestine because it meant a loosening of the Roman and Christian grip on power in the region. There was heated speculation that what was going on might be a fulfillment of ancient prophecies. They were saying that the prophet had appeared coming with the Saracens, and that he was proclaiming the advent of the Anointed One, the Christ that was to come. This, some Jews concluded, was the coming of the Messiah, perfectly timed to show that Jesus Christ was a fraud and that the last days of man had arrived. Of course, not all were persuaded. However, as one learned rabbi put it, Muhammad was a false prophet, for the prophets do not come armed with a sword. The fact that there are other texts that say that the Arabs were welcomed by Jews as liberators from Roman rule provides important corroborating evidence about positive local reactions to the rising profile of Islam. One text about this period, written a century later, in the 8th century, reports how an angel came to Rabbi Shimon Yochai after he became disturbed by the suffering inflicted in the wake of Heraclius' recovery of Jerusalem and the forced baptism and persecution of the Jews that followed. "How do we know the Muslims are our salvation?" he purportedly asked. "Do not be afraid," the angel reassured him, "for God is bringing about the kingdom of the Arabs only for the purpose of delivering you from that wicked Rome. In accordance with his will, he shall raise up over them a prophet, and he will conquer the land for them, and they shall come and restore it with grandeur." And it was precisely, one needs to know that it was because Jesus did not come with a sword to basically overthrow those that were persecuting God's people, that the Jews did not believe that Christ was their prophet. However, there were some Jews that believed that Christ was their prophet, and then there were those who did not. Of course, in accordance with Muhammad, he was seen as the means of fulfilling Jewish messianic hopes. These were lands that belonged to the descendants of Abraham, they thought, which meant solidarity between Arab and Jew. There were other tactical reasons to cooperate with the advancing armies. At Hebron, for instance, Jews offered to cut a deal with the Arab commanders. "Grant us security so that we would have a similar status among you, and allow us the right to build a synagogue in front of the entrance to the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham was buried." In return, Jewish leaders stated, "We will show you where to make a gateway in order to get past the city's formidable defenses." Support from the local population was a crucial factor in the successes of the Arabs in Palestine and Syria in the early 630s, as we have seen already. Recent research on the Greek, Syriac, and Arabic sources has shown that in the earliest accounts, the arrival of the attacking armies was welcomed by the Jews. This was not surprising. If we peel back the colorful latter additions and venomous interpretation, such as claims that the Muslims were guilty of satanic hypocrisy, we read that the military commander who led the army to Jerusalem entered the holy city in the humble dress of a pilgrim, keen to worship alongside those whose religious views were apparently seen as being, if not compatible, then at least not entirely dissimilar. There were other groups in the Middle East as well who were not disillusioned by the rise of Islam. The region as a whole was filled with religious nonconformists. There was a plethora of Christian sects that took issue with decisions made at church councils or objected to doctrines that they deemed heretical. This was particularly true in Palestine and Sinai, where there were many Christian communities violently opposed to the conclusions reached at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 about the precise meaning of the divine nature of Jesus Christ, and who had been the subject of formal persecution as a result. These Christian groups found themselves no better off following Heraclius' spectacular recovery against the Persians, thanks to the assertive orthodox religious posturing that accompanied the emperor's reconquests. As such, some saw these successes as a means to an end, but also as being religiously sympathetic. John of Damascene, the metropolitan of Nisibis, was told by the astute Arab commander wanting to establish himself in the city that if the former provided his backing, he in turn would not just help the cleric depose the leading figure in the Christian church in the East, but install him in his place. A letter sent in the 640s by a prominent cleric reports that the new rulers not only did not fight against Christians, but even commend our religion, show honor to the priests and monasteries and saints of our Lord, and make gifts endowing religious institutions. In this context, the messages of Muhammad and his followers earned the solidarity of local Christian populations. For one thing, Islam's stark warning about polytheism and the worship of idols had an obvious resonance with Christians, whose own teachings mirrored these views precisely. Of course, also as well as Judaism. A sense of camaraderie was also reinforced by a familiar cast of characters such as Moses, Noah, Job, and Zechariah, who appear in the Quran alongside explicit statements that the God who gave Moses the scriptures and who sent other apostles after him was now sending another prophet to spread the word. Awareness of common ground with Christians and Jews was reinforced by the use of familiar reference points and by accentuating similarities in matters of custom and religious doctrine. God had not chosen to reveal messages only to Muhammad. He has already revealed the Torah and the Gospel for the guidance of mankind, reads one verse in the Quran. Remember the words of angels told to Mary, mother of Jesus, says another verse. Echoing the Hail Mary, Islam's holy book teaches the words, God has chosen you, Mary. He has made you pure and exalted you above womankind. Mary, be obedient to your Lord. Bow down and worship with the worshippers. For Christians who were mired in arguments about the nature of Jesus and the Trinity, perhaps most striking was the fact that Muhammad's revelations contained a core message that was both powerful and simple. There is one God, and Muhammad his messenger. It was easy to understand and chimed with the basis of the Christian faith that God was all-powerful, and that from time to time apostles were sent to pass on messages from above. Christians and Jews who argued with each other about religion were crazy. Records another verse in the Quran, have you no sense? Division was the work of Satan, Muhammad's text warned. Never allow disagreements to take hold. Instead, cling together to God and never be divided. Muhammad's message was one of conciliation. Believers who follow the Jewish faith or are Christians who live good lives have nothing to fear or regret, says the Quran on more than one occasion. Those who believe in one God were to be honored and respected. Of course, there were also customs and rulings that later became associated with Islam and which predated Muhammad but were now adopted apparently by the Prophet himself. At this time, we see the three Abrahamic faiths, the monotheistic faiths, that of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are now we are now entering a new phase in history where now we find more so than not the death of the polytheistic gods and goddesses, and now to the one ultimate God or source. And of course, this will follow on for another 2,000 years, even into our present day. But of course, there were also customs and rulings that later became associated with Islam and which predated Muhammad but are now adopted apparently by the Prophet himself. For example, amputation as a punishment for theft and the passing of a death sentence for those who renounced their faith were common practices that were taken on by Muslims. We see them in Jewish scriptures as well. Elements like almsgiving, fasting, pilgrimage, and prayer became central components of Islam, compounding the sense of continuity and familiarity. The similarities with Christianity and Judaism later became a sensitive topic, which was partly dealt with by the dogma that Muhammad was illiterate. This insulated him from claims that he was familiar with the teachings of the Torah and the Bible, despite near contemporaries commenting that he was learned and knew both the Old and New Testament. Some have gone further still, seeking to claim that the Quran has as its base a Christian lectionary written in an Aramaic derivative that was subsequently adapted and remolded. This, like many claims that challenge or dismiss the Islamic tradition, has gained notoriety, though it has limited support among modern historians. Of course, Christians and Jews were core constituencies for support during the first phase of Islamic expansion. Explains why one of the first verses in the Quran that relates to contemporary events during Muhammad's lifetime spoke in positive terms about the Romans. The Romans have been defeated, says the Quran, referring to 81 of a number of chronic setbacks during the wars with Persia before the late 620s. But in a few years they shall themselves gain victory, such being the will of God before and after. This would be guaranteed. God does not fail in his promises. The message was inclusive and familiar and seemed to draw the sting out of the fractious arguments that had set Christians on edge. From their perspective, Islam looked inclusive and conciliatory and offered hope of calming tensions. In fact, the sources are full of examples of Christians admiring what they saw among the Muslims and their armies. One text from the 8th century notes how one Christian ascetic was sent to observe the enemy and came back impressed by the experience. I come to you from a people staying up through the night praying, he supposedly told his peers, and remaining abstinent during the day, commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, monks by night, lions by day. This seemed entirely commendable and served to blur the lines between Christianity and Islam. The fact that other accounts of this period talk of Christian monks adopting Muhammad's teachings provides another sign of differences of doctrine not being entirely clear-cut. The asceticism espoused by the early Muslims was also recognizable and laudable, providing a culturally familiar reference point to the Greco-Roman world. Efforts to conciliate with the Christians were supplemented by a policy of protecting and respecting the people of the book, that is to say, both Jews and Christians. The Quran makes plain that early Muslims saw themselves not as rivals of these two faiths, but as heir to the same legacy. Muhammad's revelations had previously been revealed to Abraham and Ishmael, to Isaac and Jacob and the tribes. God had entrusted the same message to Moses and Jesus too, they had said. We discriminate against none of them, says the Quran. In other words, the prophets of Judaism and Christianity were the same as those of Islam. Of course, Islam just goes a step further. It does denounce Christ as being Messiah, but does say that Jesus was a prophet, and also says that Muhammad was a prophet. It is no coincidence, then, that the Quran makes more than 60 references to the word Ummah, used not as an ethnic label, but to mean a community of believers. On several occasions, the text notes mournfully that mankind was once a single Ummah before differences drove people apart. The implicit message was that it was God's will that the differences should be put to one side. Similarities between the great monotheistic faiths are played up in the Quran and in the Hadith, the collections of comments, sayings, and deeds of the Prophet, while the differences are consistently played down. The emphasis on treating Jews and Christians alike with respect to tolerance is unmistakable, however. The sources for this period are notoriously difficult to interpret because they are complicated and contradictory, but also because many were written long after the events had occurred. However, recent advances in paleography, the discovery of wisps of text that were previously unknown, and increasingly sophisticated ways of understanding written material are transforming long-held views of this epic period in history. Thus, while the Islamic tradition has long held that Muhammad died in 632, recent scholarship suggests that the Prophet may have been alive later. Multiple sources from the 7th and 8th centuries attest to a charismatic preacher figure, recently suggested as being Muhammad himself, directing the Arab forces and spurring them onwards at the gates of Jerusalem. The extraordinary progress of Muhammad's followers in Palestine was matched by a helpless and inept response by the authorities. Some members of the Christian clergy fought a desperate rearguard action, painting the Arabs in the worst possible light in a doomed attempt to convince the local population not to be fooled into giving their support to a message that sounded both simple and familiar. The Saracens are vengeful and hate God, warned the Patriarch of Jerusalem shortly after the conquest of the city. They plunder cities, ravage the countryside fields, set fires to churches, and destroy monasteries. The evil they commit against Christ and against the church is appalling, as are the foul blasphemies they pronounce about God. In fact, it appears that the Arab conquests were neither as brutal nor as shocking as the commentators make out. Across Syria and Palestine, for example, there is little evidence of violent conquest in the archaeological record. Damascus, for instance, the most important city in northern Syria, surrendered quickly after terms were agreed between the local bishop and the attacking Arab commander. Even allowing for some poetic license, the compromise was both reasonable and realistic. In exchange for allowing churches to remain open and untouched and for the Christian population to remain unmolested, the inhabitants agreed to recognize the overlordship of new masters. In practice, what this meant was paying tax not to Constantinople and to the imperial authorities, but to representatives of the Prophet, the caliphs, and the believers. It was a process that was replicated time and again as the Arabs began to fan out in every direction, racing down the trade and communication routes. Armies swarmed into southwestern Iran before attention turned to hunting down Yazdagerd III, the last Sasanian king who had fled east. Expeditionary forces that set out against Egypt caused chaos by operating in tandem, resulting in limited and ineffective military resistance, made worse by local populations fighting against each other or being willing to negotiate terms in the face of fear and uncertainty. Alexandria, a jewel of the eastern Mediterranean, was demilitarized and forced to promise a vast tribute in exchange for assurances that churches would be left intact and the Christian population left to their own devices. News of this agreement was met with weeping and wailing in Alexandria, and even by calls that the man who had brokered it, the patriarch Cyrus, should be stoned for his betrayal. "I have made this treaty," he declared in his defense, "in order to save you and your children." And with this, records one author writing a century or so later, the Muslims took control of all Egypt, south and north, and in doing so, trebled their income from taxes. God was punishing Christians for their sins, wrote another author at the time. In an almost perfect model of expansion, the threat of military force led to negotiated settlements as one province after another submitted to the new authorities. To start with, overlordship in conquered territories was light and even unobtrusive. By and large, the existing majority populations were allowed to get on with their business unmolested by the new masters who established garrisons and living quarters away from existing urban centers. In some cases, new cities were founded for the Muslims, such as Fustat in Egypt, Kufa on the Euphrates, and Ramla in Palestine, and Ala in modern Jordan, where the sites of mosques and governors' palaces could be chosen and built from scratch. The fact that new churches were built at the same time in North Africa, Egypt, and Palestine suggests that a modus vivendi quickly established itself where religious tolerance was normative. This seems to have been echoed in lands taken from the Sasanians, where, at least to start with, Zoroastrians were either ignored or left alone to themselves. In the case of Jews and Christians, it is not impossible that this was even formalized. A complex and contentious text known as the Pact of Umar purports to set out the rights that the so-called people of the book would enjoy from their new overlords, and conversely to set out the basis for interaction with Islam. No crosses were to be marked on mosques, the Quran was not to be taught to non-Muslim children, but no one was to be prevented from conversion to Islam. Muslims were to be respected at all times and were to be given directions if they asked for help. Cohabitation of the faiths was an important hallmark of early Islamic expansion, and was an important part of its actual success. In response, some hedged their bets, as pottery kilns from Jerash in northern Jordan show. Lamps were produced in the 7th century with a Christian inscription in Latin on one side and an Islamic invocation in Arabic on the other. This was in part a pragmatic response to recent experiences, given that the Persian occupation of this region had lasted for only 25 years. There was no guarantee that the Arab masters were necessarily going to last either, as a 7th century Greek text makes absolutely clear. The body will renew itself, the author reassured his readers. There was hope that the Muslim conquests might be a flash in the pan. The new regime's lightness of touch also showed itself in matters of administration. Roman coinage was used for several decades after the conquests, alongside newly minted coins struck with familiar imagery, and in long-established denominations, the existing legal systems were broadly left intact as well. Existing norms on a raft of social practices were adopted by the conquerors, including a number concerned with inheritance, dowries, oaths, and marriage, as well as fasting. In many cases, governors and bureaucrats were left in position in former Sasanian and Roman territories. Part of the reason for this was simple mathematics. The conquerors, whether Arabs or non-Arabs, true believers, or those who had joined them and submitted to their authority, were in chronic minority, which meant that working with the local community was not so much a choice as it was a necessity. Doing so also happened because, in the grand scheme of things, there were larger battles to be fought following the successes in Persia, Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. One was the continued struggle with the shattered remains of the Roman Empire. Constantinople itself was put under sustained pressure as the Arab leadership sought to finish the Romans off once and for all. More important even than that, however, was the battle for the soul of Islam. In a parallel with early Christianity's internal wrangles, establishing precisely what Muhammad had been told, how it should be recorded and spread, and to whom, became a source of major concern after his death. These struggles were ferocious, of the first 4 men appointed to follow the prophet as his representative, successor, or caliph, 3 were assassinated. There were furious arguments about how to interpret Muhammad's teachings and desperate efforts to twist or appropriate his legacy. It was to try to standardize what precisely Muhammad's message had been that the order was given, most probably in the last quarter of the 7th century, for it is to be written down in a single text, the Quran. The antagonism between rival factions served to harden attitudes to non-Muslims, with each group claiming to be more faithful guardians of the words of the Prophet and therefore the will of God. It was perhaps not surprising that attention would soon turn to the kafir, those who were not believers. Muslim leaders had been tolerant and even gracious to Christians, rebuilding the church of Edessa after it was damaged by an earthquake in 679. But in the late 7th century, things began to change. Attention turned to proselytizing, evangelizing, and converting the local population to Islam, alongside an increasingly hostile attitude toward them. One manifestation of this came during what modern commentators sometimes dubbed the coin wars, as propaganda blows were traded on pieces of currency. After the Caliph began to issue coins with the legend, "There is no God but God alone, Muhammad is the messenger of God," in the early 690s, Constantinople retaliated. Coins were struck which no longer had the image of the emperor on the front, the obverse, but put it on the reverse instead. In its place on the obverse was a dramatic new image, Jesus Christ. The intention was to reinforce Christian identity and to demonstrate that the empire enjoyed divine protection. In an extraordinary development, the Islamic world now matched the Christians like with like. Remarkably, the initial response to the issuing of coins with Jesus and the emperor on them was to respond with an image on coins minted for a few short years of a man in the parallel role to that played by Jesus, as the protector of the lands of the faithful. Although this image is usually presumed to be that of the Caliph Abd al-Malik, it is entirely possible that this is none other than Muhammad himself. He appears in a flowing tunic with a lustrous beard and holding a sword in a scabbard. If this is the prophet, then it is the earliest known image of him, and remarkably one that those who knew him during his lifetime were aware of and saw for themselves. One Muslim, writing over a century later, reports that some of Muhammad's surviving companions in Medina who had known him well saw these coins. Another much later writer who had access to early Islamic material says much the same, noting that the Prophet's own friends were uncomfortable about the use of an image in this way. The coins did not stay in circulation long, for by the end of the 690s, the currency circulating in the Islamic world was completely redesigned. All images were removed and were replaced by verses from the Quran on both sides of the coin. So here you can see a coin that was minted in time with Jesus on one side and then Muhammad on the other side. Converting Christians was not the most important goal in the late 7th century. However, for the key battleground was between rival Muslim factions. Fierce debate broke out between those claiming to be the rightful heir to Muhammad, during which the trump card became knowing the most about the Prophet's early life. So acute did competition become that there were serious and concerted efforts to relocate the center of the religion away from Mecca and establish it in Jerusalem after one powerful faction emerged in the Middle East and turned against traditionalists in southern Arabia. The Mosque of the Dome of the Rock, the first major Islamic sacred building, was constructed at the start of the 690s, partly with the intention of diverting attention away from Mecca. As one modern commentator puts it, buildings and material culture were being used as a weapon for ideological conflict during a volatile period of civil war, a time when the Caliph was taking up arms against the direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad himself. The strife within the Muslim world explains inscriptions that were set in mosaic on both the outer and inner faces of the Dome of the Rock Mosque, which were aimed at mollifying Christians. Worship God, the compassionate and merciful, honor and bless his prophet Muhammad, they read. But they also proclaimed that Jesus was the Messiah. So belief in God and his envoys, bless your envoy and your servant Jesus, son of Mary, and peace be on him, on the day of birth and on the day of death and on the day he is raised from the dead. Even in the 690s, in other words, there was a blurring of religious boundaries. So close, in fact, did Islam seem that some Christian scholars thought its teachings were not so much those of a new faith as a divergent interpretation of Christianity. According to John of Damascus, one of the leading commentators of the time, Islam was a Christian heresy rather than a different religion. Muhammad, he wrote, had come up with his ideas based on his reading of the Old and New Testaments and on a conversation with an errant Christian monk. In spite, or perhaps because of, the relentless jostling for position and authority at the center of the Muslim world, the peripheries continued to see astonishing expansion. Commanders who were happier in the field than fighting political and theological battles led armies ever deeper into Central Asia, the Caucasus, and North Africa. In the case of the latter, North Africa, the advance seemed relentless. After crossing the Straits of Gibraltar, the armies flooded through Spain and into France, where they met resistance in 732, somewhere between Poitiers and Tours, barely 200 miles from Paris. In a battle that subsequently acquired a near mythical status as the moment the Islamic surge was halted, Charles Martel, the Hammer, led a force that inflicted a crucial defeat. The fate of Christian Europe hung by a thread. Later historians argued that had it not been for the heroism and skill of the defenders, the continent would surely have become Muslim. The truth is that while the defeat was certainly a setback, it did not mean that new attacks would not be unleashed in the future, if, that is, there were prizes worth winning. And as far as Western Europe was concerned in this period, these prizes were few and far between. Wealth and rewards lay elsewhere.